You accept emotional crumbs, mixed with small doses of affection, without realizing that this combination is slowly imprisoning you. You call it love, believe it's care, but deep down you know something isn't right. Your soul feels suffocated as you desperately try to justify the prison. Fyodor Dostoevsky, with almost cruel lucidity, had already uncovered this disturbing dynamic long before you even existed. Between the lines of his works, especially in female characters like Grushenka and Nastasia Filipovna, he revealed an uncomfortable truth, one most people prefer to ignore because it hurts too much to admit. Not all domination needs to be violent or explicit to be powerful. Sometimes, it comes disguised as delicately manipulated vulnerability, in promises left unfulfilled and small gestures that bind tighter than physical chains ever could. Maybe you've asked yourself why it feels so hard to leave, even when you know, clearly, that this relationship isn't good for you. Maybe you feel guilty for feeling trapped, for believing you should be stronger or more self-aware. But the truth is far more complex than just strength or weakness. Dostoevsky didn't create weak women. He created emotionally strategic women who didn't dominate with force, but with weaponized sensitivity. And that doesn't mean feminine domination is always intentional or malicious, but sometimes wounded women, unresolved in their own pain, unknowingly reproduce emotional patterns that entrap both themselves and others. Carl Jung, decades later, would give this phenomenon a name, speaking of shadows and unconscious projections. A woman who hasn't faced her shadow inevitably ends up manipulating, even without clear intent. And the man who ignores this dynamic becomes enslaved by his own need for affection and approval. The illusion of feminine fragility, so romantic and idealized, is, in reality, a symbolic trap. It's an irresistible invitation to a dangerous emotional dance, swinging between tenderness and abandonment, attention and coldness. A recent study from the University of Rochester revealed that men are especially emotionally vulnerable to women who alternate affection with subtle emotional withdrawal. This effect, which we might call the Grushenka effect, still governs modern relationships, often silently, subtly. You might now realize that you were never weak, only emotionally manipulated. That realization is both liberating and terrifying. It forces you to stare directly at the hidden dynamic running beneath your relationships. You begin to see that Dostoevsky didn't write fiction. He wrote disturbing emotional mirrors of human reality. The revelation lies in understanding that your longing for love and connection has been used against you. Not because you don't deserve affection, but because you haven't yet learned to distinguish between genuine love and covert emotional control. Today, you'll see clearly what Dostoevsky left between the lines, the uncomfortable truth behind feminine domination that he captured with unnerving precision. And above all, you'll begin to understand how to take back the reins of your emotional life. It's time to uncover how this silent domination works and realize that freedom begins the moment you finally recognize what's been in front of you all along. You're not being crushed by force. You're being dismantled by your own craving to be chosen. That's the real trap. This silent hunger for recognition that turns you into someone manipulable, even by the slightest gesture of affection. It's not the threat that paralyzes you. It's the hope. That irrational hope that maybe this time, if you're calm enough, good enough, patient enough, they'll finally see you. But they won't, because the more you mold yourself to be desirable, the more invisible you become. And those who know how to play with this don't need to raise their voice. They just need to withhold a little warmth, a little gaze, a little "I'm proud of you." And suddenly, you're crawling through your own ruins, begging for the version of them that never really existed. This is where Dostoevsky's genius cuts like a knife. He didn't write about women who dominate with cruelty. He wrote about those who dominate with need. Grushenka doesn't scream. She withdraws. She plays on the edge of affection and absence, knowing that a man starving for meaning will offer his soul in exchange for crumbs of validation. You think it's love, but it's your desperation negotiating with silence. You don't need someone to hurt you to feel enslaved. You just need someone to awaken your fear of being abandoned and then step away at the right moment. Again and again. What keeps you trapped isn't the other. It's the version of yourself you think will finally be worthy if you stay. You build entire justifications around their behavior. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe it's your fault. Maybe love is supposed to be hard. You rewrite reality so it doesn't break the illusion. But deep down, a part of you knows that this isn't love, knows that you're not free, knows that something is feeding off your emotional fatigue like it's fuel, and you keep smiling, keep showing up, keep pretending it's fine, because the thought of being unwanted is more terrifying than the pain of being emotionally dominated. Let me tell you this, that craving, this insatiable hunger to be picked, is not your truth. It's your trauma. It's the echo of a childhood where you had to earn love, where silence was a weapon, where you learned that your presence wasn't enough unless it was useful, pleasant, silent. So now, as an adult, you find yourself chained not to a person, but to a memory disguised as affection. Every time you stay in a dynamic like this, you're not loving them. You're trying to fix the past. And the past doesn't care. This is why I need your help. If this truth is waking something up in you, if this video is giving voice to what you've lived in silence, please support this channel. Like this video, subscribe. That's what allows me to keep revealing what most people are too afraid to say. Because what we're about to uncover, it goes even deeper. The sweetness you chase might be the very poison that keeps you docile. And that's exactly how emotional domination survives, by looking like love. You think she's fragile. You think you're protecting her. But what if the one being played is you? Dostoevsky never painted women as weak. He painted them as chaos wrapped in lace. Grushenka, Nastasia Filipovna, Liza, these aren't just characters. They're emotional architects, capable of turning longing into submission and guilt into obedience. They don't control with commands. They control with silence, with tears that arrive exactly when you're about to walk away, with apologies that come laced in just enough vulnerability to make you stay. Not because they want to change, but because they know you need to believe they will. What looks like emotional surrender is often strategic survival. And what you interpret as a cry for help is sometimes the echo of a game already in motion. It's not always conscious, and that's what makes it more dangerous. The most lethal patterns aren't chosen, they're inherited. When a woman hasn't healed her wounds, she becomes a mirror of the mother who gave love as a reward and withdrawal as punishment. And now, she repeats the pattern, not because she's cruel, but because that's how she learned to stay safe, by controlling who gets close and when. You don't see a manipulator. You see someone who needs saving. And that's how you become the perfect pawn, because your desire to rescue makes you predictable. She cries, you come closer. She pulls away, you try harder. She says you hurt her, you apologize. And in this cycle, you begin to disappear. Slowly, quietly. And no one notices, not even you, because on the surface, you're still functioning. You're still working, providing, showing up. But inside, your identity is dissolving into the role she needs you to play. This isn't about blaming women. This is about exposing the unconscious game between the masculine and the feminine when neither has faced their shadow. Jung would say, when a shadow is not acknowledged, it is projected. And projections are never neutral. They demand actors. So she becomes the wounded child and you become the guilty parent. Or worse, the addict begging for the next dose of affection. And what should have been a relationship becomes a stage for unhealed traumas to reenact themselves again and again. Dostoevsky understood this complexity with frightening clarity. His women aren't evil. They're survival mechanisms with a face. And his men, they are often paralyzed not by fear, but by the illusion of being needed. The most sophisticated domination is the one that disguises itself as intimacy. And in this masquerade, you end up calling captivity closeness. So ask yourself, do you love her? Or do you love who you think you are when she needs you? There's a difference. One is connection. The other is dependence. And if your presence only matters when she's falling apart, then you're not her partner. You're her safety net. And safety nets, over time, become cages. There's a truth here most people can't stomach. Not every tear is pure. Not every wound is innocent. And not every woman wants healing. Some have made a home inside the chaos. And they need you broken to keep their illusion intact. The question is, how long are you willing to stay on a battlefield disguised as a bedroom? You've been taught to believe that if it hurts, it must be real. That love, when deep, comes with suffering. That passion must burn, leave scars, consume your peace. And that's exactly where the trap hides, because what you've called intensity is often just your nervous system reliving trauma. Emotional domination rarely starts with cruelty. It begins with ecstasy, with the feeling that someone finally sees you, finally chooses you, finally ignites something that makes life feel meaningful again. But what you think is soul connection is sometimes just trauma recognizing trauma. This is how it works. You meet someone and there's a rush. They mirror your fears, your desires, your unresolved wounds. It feels magnetic, spiritual even, and then the withdrawal begins. Subtle. They grow cold without reason. They pull away without explanation. And you start chasing the version of them that made you feel alive. This is the blueprint of emotional control. Not through fear, through hope. Hope that the intensity will return. That was real, that you didn't imagine it. So you justify their mood swings. You become more available, more forgiving, more patient. Until one day, you're not even you anymore. You're just a reaction to their absence. You don't realize it right away. It's a slow bleed. The kind that looks like loyalty on the outside, but inside, it's codependence dressed as devotion. You say you're staying because love requires sacrifice. But what if what you're sacrificing isn't ego, but your identity? What if what you call passion is really your inner child, trying to fix what was broken long before this relationship began? This is the seduction of pain. We become addicted to the chemical highs and lows. The dopamine spikes when they finally look at you again. The relief when they say they were just having a hard time. The tiny reward that makes the suffering feel worth it. But this isn't love. It's a cycle, a repetition, a loop designed not by fate, but by your own unhealed patterns. Dostoevsky's characters live this contradiction. They bleed for those who wound them. They mistake torment for depth. And in doing so, they expose something uncomfortable about us all. We often cling to the relationships that hurt us the most because they feel familiar. And familiarity, no matter how toxic, feels safe when you've never known anything else. So let's be brutally honest. You're not staying because it's real. You're staying because leaving would force you to face a silence louder than the chaos you've normalized. And that silence? It would make you feel what you've spent years avoiding. Abandonment, inadequacy, emptiness. But those feelings won't kill you. Living in a loop of emotional punishment disguised as connection, that will. When love consistently feels like survival, like negotiation, like performing for worth, it's not love. It's trauma bonding. And until you break the spell of confusion between pain and passion, every relationship will be a different face on the same wound. The next realization might hurt even more, but it holds the key to everything. Because the person who keeps you begging for love may just be the projection of a wound you never had the courage to confront. The one you can't let go of is the embodiment of the wound you never closed. That's the part no one tells you. When you fall hard, obsessively, destructively, it's rarely about who they are. It's about what they activate. Jung was precise. What we don't integrate, we project. And projections don't ask for permission. They invade. You fall not for a person, but for the unfinished memory they awaken. They become the echo of the parent you could never please. The authority figure whose attention came at a price. The unpredictable caretaker who taught you that love has to be earned and can vanish the moment you stop performing. And so you chase, not them, but the emotional resolution you never had. You confuse healing with attachment and domination with desire. You think you love this person, but what if you're just addicted to the familiar rhythm of their coldness and warmth? What if their absence stings because it mirrors the void you've been carrying since childhood? What if you're not actually in love, but reenacting the trauma in hopes of rewriting the ending? This is the anatomy of emotional submission. It looks voluntary, but it's reenactment, repetition, psychological debt unpaid for decades. And no matter how much insight you gain, the emotional grip doesn't release until you stop believing the lie that this dynamic is special. It's not. It's ancient. It began long before you met them. They just fit the shape of the ghost that's been haunting you. You might tell yourself you're the one choosing, that you're loyal, committed, deep. But ask this, if they stopped pulling away, if they gave you unconditional consistency, would you still feel the same pull? Or would the absence of the chase make them suddenly less magnetic? Be honest, because if what excites you is their unpredictability, then what you're in love with is not them. It's the hope of finally being enough for someone who keeps you uncertain. There is a brutal clarity here. The person who dominates you emotionally often doesn't even know they're doing it. But they don't need to, because you've already handed them the throne. Not because they deserve it, but because your emotional blueprint is still trying to find redemption through the wrong people. It's hard to admit, painful even, but once you see it, the game loses its power. You stop asking why they act this way. You start asking why you tolerate it. You stop trying to fix them, and you begin confronting what part of you still believes you must bleed to be loved. This is not about blame. It's about responsibility. About finally seeing that the patterns you're stuck in are not destiny. They're instructions you've followed for too long without questioning. Instructions passed down through wounds, not wisdom. So if it hurts, don't just ask what they're doing. Ask what you're repeating. And more importantly, ask what you're ready to stop believing. Because the next step isn't about them anymore. It's about whether you're finally ready to sit with the silence they used to fill and listen to what your own psyche has been trying to scream beneath all the noise. You became a mirror, not a person, a reflection that adjusts itself to whatever the other needs to see. That's how you survive in relationships that slowly erase you. You shine when they need light. You soften when they grow sharp. You disappear when your presence becomes inconvenient. And in that choreography of emotional adaptation, you forget what it feels like to be whole. Because they don't love you. They love the version of themselves they see when you stop being you. And you, desperate to be kept, you start mistaking that performance for love. This is the silent tragedy of emotional dependency. It doesn't scream. It whispers. You wake up each day asking how to make yourself more acceptable. You read into every silence. You overanalyze every text. You apologize before they even accuse. You shape-shift into whatever won't be abandoned. And in that constant bending, you forget how to stand. They don't need to control you directly, because you've already internalized the rules. Stay pleasant. Stay useful. Stay small. And what do you get in return? Fragments. Occasional warmth. A compliment when you're about to break. A moment of closeness that erases days of neglect. You call it connection, but it's conditioning. You're not being loved. You're being trained. Trained to crave their approval. Trained to fear their distance. Trained to stay loyal to the same person who keeps you emotionally malnourished. This is how subtle domination works. Not through orders, but through omission. They don't need to tell you you're not enough. They just need to withhold affection long enough for you to believe it yourself. And once that belief takes root, you do the rest of the work for them. You criticize yourself. You suppress your needs. You second-guess your instincts. You slowly sculpt yourself into someone less threatening, less demanding, more convenient. And yet, you call it love. You tell yourself that if you're patient enough, gentle enough, forgiving enough, they'll finally see you. But here's the truth. If someone only sees you when you disappear, then what they love is the silence you provide, not your soul. They love the space you leave, not the fullness you carry. Dostoevsky knew this agony. His characters aren't just dramatic, they're fractured. They exist in that gray space between devotion and self-erasure. And he showed us what happens when a person trades authenticity for attachment. They become haunted, not by ghosts, but by the parts of themselves they buried just to be held. So let me ask you, who are you when you stop performing? Who are you when you're no longer trying to be chosen? That silence you fear, it isn't empty. It's the birthplace of your real self. The self that doesn't beg. The self that doesn't bend to unspoken rules. The self that has nothing to prove, nothing to shrink, nothing to trade for presence. Because clarity begins where performance ends. And once you stop reflecting others, you'll finally start seeing yourself, not as an accessory to their emotional chaos, but as a whole, vivid, dangerous presence who no longer needs to be dimmed to be kept. That moment, when you stop asking who they need you to be and start remembering who you were before all the pleasing, that's not the end of love. That's the start of freedom. There comes a point when words no longer matter. When you've explained yourself so many times, twisted your truth to be palatable, softened your edges to avoid conflict, and still, nothing changes. You realize it's not misunderstanding that keeps the dynamic alive. It's the fact that your reactions are still predictable. You still respond. You still explain. You still defend your heart, hoping they'll finally treat it with care. But here's what they'll never tell you. As long as you keep reacting, they keep controlling. Not through dominance, through rhythm. They move, you move. They pause, you chase. They wound, you explain. That's not love. That's choreography. And it ends the moment you go still. Silence is misunderstood. People think it's weakness, avoidance, apathy. But in truth, it's the most dangerous form of clarity. Silence is where manipulation dies, because it has nothing to feed on. It's where the emotional hook dissolves, because there's no tension to pull. When you stop explaining, they have nothing to twist. When you stop proving your intentions, they have nothing to question. And when you stop participating in the emotional cycle they built, the game breaks. This is the rupture most people never dare. Not walking away in rage, but withdrawing your energy without noise. Choosing distance not as punishment, but as boundary. You realize that the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all, because silence is not absence. It's a decision. A line, a refusal to be available for the same pain over and over again. You see, they weren't feeding on your presence. They were feeding on your reaction. The text you'd send in a spiral. The voice notes explaining how much it hurt. The essays trying to clarify your tone, your heart, your loyalty. But the moment you go silent, truly silent, something terrifying happens to them. They lose control. because now the power dynamic shifts. You're no longer the predictable responder. You become a mystery, and that mystery forces them to look at what they've refused to see themselves. Dostoevsky wrote characters who shouted and wept, but the most haunting ones were those who withdrew, those who no longer fought for understanding. Because once you cross that threshold, once you see that your noise only prolongs the cycle, you step into something much deeper than survival. You step into self-respect, into stillness. And in that stillness, you start to hear something else. Your own voice, finally untouched by their chaos. Let me make this brutally clear. You don't owe your pain an explanation. You don't owe your boundaries an apology. You don't owe anyone access to the parts of you that had a break just to keep them comfortable. If your silence makes them uncomfortable, it means your presence was never truly valued, only consumed. So let it be quiet. Let the cycle collapse in the absence of your reaction. Let the space they created with their emotional games be filled, not with begging or rage, but with your stillness. That's where your power returns. In the decision to no longer explain your worth. In the sacred refusal to keep bleeding in places that never asked how deep the cuts went. And when they reach out, when they ask what happened, you won't need to answer. Because nothing happened. You just stopped dancing. You weren't dominated by cruelty. You were dominated by your craving for meaning. That's what makes this kind of control so hard to escape. It wears the mask of connection. But behind every emotional loop you couldn't break was a silent plea for identity, a hunger to finally feel like you mattered. You didn't stay because you were weak. You stayed because a part of you believed this was the only place you could be seen. But what you called love was often just a transaction built on your fear of vanishing. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's the spine of it all. You thought this was fate, a bond, a soul connection, but it was a projection, a reenactment, a shadow begging for attention through the people you chose. You didn't fall in love. You fell into memory, into echoes, into patterns inherited from the unloved places of your past. And that's not your fault. But now, it is your responsibility. You can no longer afford to play innocent in your own life. Nietzsche believed that the person who cannot command themselves will always serve something outside. And that's what this has been. You serving a fantasy. Serving the version of you that needed to be needed. Serving someone who was never meant to carry the burden of your validation. So now what? Now comes the silence. Not as a void, but as a weapon. Now comes the refusal. Not out of pride, but out of reverence for the soul you almost buried. Now comes the truth. You were never just a victim of someone's emotional manipulation. You were also the architect of your own submission. And that stings, because it forces you to confront the hardest question of all. How much of your pain came from others? And how much from the parts of you that kept allowing it? There's no comfort in that answer, only power. Because once you admit that you handed over the throne, you can take it back. This isn't about blaming yourself. It's about recovering the pieces. The versions of you that were left behind while you try to be lovable, safe, non-threatening. You don't need to become cruel. You need to become whole. And wholeness begins when you stop trading your truth for affection. So if something in this video cracked open a memory, a wound, a mirror you've been avoiding, don't run from it. Stay. Feel it. Let it haunt you a little. That discomfort you feel is the start of freedom. And if this spoke to your silence, your exhaustion, your clarity, leave a comment. Subscribe. That's how you help me keep this alive. That's how you help this truth keep reaching the people who've never had words for their own pain. Because in the end, this was never just about them. It was about you. And the moment you realize that your silence isn't submission, it's resurrection. The symbol I'll leave you with is this, a bleeding rose. Beautiful, fragile, deadly, Because sometimes what wounds you the most is also what you love the hardest. Now ask yourself, are you finally ready to stop bleeding for beauty?